Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, or morning if it's that's the time where you are. We're delighted to have so many people register onto our webinar. We've had people all over the world. They've come from America, Canada, Australia, and we'd like to thank you all for coming. We've got an excellent group of panelists with us today. We've got Matt Ridley, Inaya Folarin Iman, and Toby Young. And it's been a difficult time for many people in this lockdown and in this coronavirus pandemic. So it's wonderful to come all together and recreate what a democratic, vibrant society looks like from the comfort of our own living rooms. So the format of this event, we're going to hear from each speaker in turn, and then we're going to have a question and answer session at the end for everyone to feed in with their own questions. Now, you should all see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button. So as you're listening to our speakers this afternoon, please feed in your own questions on the Q&A panel. And you can also, because we love democracy at the GWPF, can vote for your favorite questions. And we're going to try and answer those once we've heard from each speaker. My name's Harry Wilkinson. I'm the head of policy at the GWPF, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar this afternoon. So our first guest is Matt Ridley, the Viscount Ridley. He's a hereditary peer in the House of Lords. He's a science writer. His books have sold millions of copies around the world. And for example, The Rational Optimist, and he's just releasing a new book called The Evolution of Everything. On climate change, he's what we call a lukewarmer. This means that while accepting that climate change is real, it's a real risk, it's a real threat, he's optimistic about mankind's ability to rise to the challenge and meet the challenge of climate change in a positive, forward-looking way. And of course, being aware of all those vitally important trends in human welfare that people seem so reluctant to believe, but indeed it's true that the world, even in these dark times, the pandemic will not affect wider trends of progress and human betterment. So we're very grateful for having you. I'm going to hand over to you any moment and then follow up with a few questions of mine. Over to you. Okay,
am I unmuted? Good.
Yes, there we go.
Thank you very much, Harry. I'm going to correct you on one thing. You said I'm about to publish a book called The Evolution of Everything. I actually published that book 5 years ago, whereas the book that I'm about to publish is called How Innovation Works. So that's given me a chance to plug it. It was going to be out this week, but it's been delayed until later in June, and we'll have a special afterword about coronavirus in it. What I want to talk about is science on the one hand and the science on the other, and the distinction between them. What is science? Well, it's not a body of knowledge, it's not a catalogue of facts, it's a method of understanding the world. And I think it's very important to understand that scientists are not in the business of accumulating facts. They're in the business of challenging mysteries, trying to go out there and find out about the unknown things of the world and understand them. So it very much has uncertainty and lack of certainty, lack of knowledge of the world built into the whole process of science. Now, the phrase "the science" is relatively recent, and it's been floating around ever since climate change became important. And it's an attempt to try and say there's only one view on one topic. And it's rather beautiful, actually, for those of us who've been complaining that this isn't the right way of looking at science, to see the way in the last few weeks, a lot of people in the media and politicians have begun saying, and I've heard the BBC presenters say exactly this. But there's no such thing as the science. There's lots of different scientific views, aren't there? Which is, yes, exactly what we've been saying. So last week, there was a headline in The Guardian that read, "There is no such thing as just following the science. Coronavirus advice is political." This was an article by Jana Basevich, a sociologist at the University of Cambridge. And she went on to say, politicians tend to favor the evidence that supports their argument. Well, knock me down with a feather. This is exactly what many of us have been saying, particularly about climate science for the last 10 or 15 years. And it's very nice to hear that people from the establishment media, the mainstream media, and the left of politics are beginning to agree with this point. She goes on to say, to begin with, there is no such thing as the best science available. Scientists regularly disagree about different issues. And that, of course, is the key point. She accuses scientists and politicians of cherry picking the evidence that suits their argument. And she talks about an arresting phrase, policy-based evidence. Now, where does that phrase come from? It's actually a sort of joke invented by climate skeptics a few years ago. When people would go on and on about evidence-based policy, climate skeptics started saying, well, hang on, what we're seeing is quite a lot of policy-based evidence. In other words, people are going off and torturing the data until they can get out of it the political message they want out of the data. And that particularly is what we saw happen in the case of the hockey stick graph of the early 2000s, which was a pretty disreputable attempt to torture the data until it confessed to the 20th century being unprecedented in terms of climate change. Now, we hear about the consensus on climate change, which we don't hear about for coronavirus. And we are told that we are heretics if we don't concede that this consensus is right. But what does that consensus actually say? Well, if you look at the past 6 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, they all say that that what climate change is going to do is it's going to warm the planet by between 1 and 4 degrees centigrade per doubling of carbon dioxide. Now, that's a huge range. 1 degree is harmless, 4 degrees is harmful. So all they're saying is it might be harmless, or it might be harmful, or it might be something in between. Now, the IPCC has been desperate to try and narrow this range over the years, but they ended up having to widen it in their last report because the evidence was pointing towards the lower end of the range. So far from there being a consensus about what climate change is going to do in very precise terms, the consensus is that we might have anything from harmless to harmful global warming, which is hardly the definition of the science. It's a very good definition of what we need to do, which is disagree about what might happen. And we are told that 97% of scientists agree with this consensus. But that's a bit weird because 97% of people agreeing that it could be harmless or harmful or anything in between is pretty obvious. I mean, I agree with that. I think it's going to be towards the harmless end of the range, but other people think it's going to be towards the harmful end of the range. So almost everybody I know is in that 97%. What President Obama tweeted in 2014 was, and I quote, 97% of scientists agree that climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. And that is false. Nobody has ever shown that a majority of scientists, let alone 97%, think that climate change is dangerous. The 97, I mean, it's pretty obvious that most people agree it's real and man-made. The question is whether it's going to be dangerous. It's as false as anything Donald Trump has ever tweeted. And where does this 97% figure come from, even for the fact that climate change is man-made? Well, there's been one attempt to actually pin down evidence to do policy-based evidence making for this claim that 97% of people think that climate change is man-made. And it was a man named John Cook in Australia and his colleagues. And what he did, he looked at hundreds, I think thousands actually, of scientific papers that mentioned climate change. and recorded whether they said it was man-made or not. And the criterion was, did they say that it was more than 50% man-made? And they said, yes, 97% of papers say this. But in doing so, they had discarded 98.4% of the papers. So they were only looking at 1.6%. And they'd chosen these ones because these ones made a specific prediction about what would happen, or rather a specific numerical analysis about what was happening. But so effectively, this was 97% of 1.6% of papers that claimed that more than 50% of the warming was man-made. And even then, the 97% of 1.6% was the ones that they had identified. It was a subjective identification, and a bunch of scientists came out of the woodwork and said, you've misidentified my paper. So this wasn't very good science. Now, why is it key to science to allow disagreement? Basically because of a problem called confirmation bias. And I think the best way of getting across the point about confirmation bias is to give you the example that was first given by the psychologist Peter Wason when he invented the term in the 1960s. He said, if I give you a series of numbers, 2, 4, 6, and I ask you to give the next 3 numbers in order to test what my rule is, on what rule am I obeying, 2, 4, 6? Most people say 8, 10, 12, because they think the rule is add 2. And they want to test whether that's the right rule. And he says, yes, you're right, that still obeys the rule. And they say, so the rule is add 2. He says, no, the rule is not add 2. The rule was simply that every number must be bigger than the last number. 7, 8, 9 would have worked just as well, would have also got a yes number, but would have disproved your rule. So instead of setting out to falsify their own hypothesis, people set out to confirm their hypothesis, to look for evidence, in the chat, David Rose is having a poll on whether I should have a beard. This is outrageous from David. Shut up. Anyway, that's enough on that. The point is that scientists are human beings, and human beings set out to prove, to support their hypotheses. They do not set out to disprove them. They say they do, but they're fibbing, because actually the way science works is that people produce evidence to support their hunches, and they're like prosecuting attorneys. They want to find the theory guilty, or rather, find the theory right. They do that, and then other people come in and attack their theory and say, no, here's evidence that you're wrong. So Professor A says Professor B's theory is wrong, and here's some evidence to prove it. And that's what keeps science honest, and that's what keeps it from going down the confirmation bias route all the time, and that's what stops it being a religion. That's what makes science different from a religion. So it is absolutely vital that red teams are built into the structure of science. That challenge is part of the whole culture of science. It's the point of science, is that somebody challenges someone else, and that way we all arrive at the truth. Now, one other thing that science is not, is that it is not forecasting. Science is about explaining the world. It is not good at forecasting the world. Philip Tetlock asked 284 experts to make a total of 28,000 predictions over 20 years, and he measured whether they were right or wrong. And the argument was they were barely better than chance, and the more expert they were in the field, the less good their prediction about that field. So telling things about the future is really, really difficult, and it's not what science is designed to do. So when we get into modeling the future, whether it's in an epidemic or in climate change, we are actually leaving behind science and going into another phenomenon. I, at this point, like to share a slide to just remind you about how incredibly bad experts are. I need to find the window. How incredibly bad experts are at, damn it, I've lost the window. How did that happen? at telling you about the future. So here are four really, really clever people who made brilliant predictions about the future that were badly wrong. Ernest Rutherford, 1933, said that anyone who expects a source of power from the transformation of the atom is talking moonshine. Ken Olsen, chairman of Digital Equipment Corporation, the most important computer company of the time, making the so-called mini computer. There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. That was in 1977. Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, in 1998. By 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will have been no greater than the fax machines. And Steve Ballmer, the head of Microsoft, in 2007, there's no chance the iPhone is going to get significant market share, no chance. So that's just to remind you that whatever scientists are good at, telling you how the future will unfold is not something that they're good at. It is vital that when this pandemic ends, the world learns the lesson that there is no such thing as the science. There are different scientific views, and it's a good thing if they disagree. That's how we get at the truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'd just like to pick up on a few different areas. One of them is the way that the climate change debate over the last decade or so has framed our perspectives towards uncertainty and risk, and to what extent we prioritize certain issues. Do you think the debate around climate change has actually meant that we've been less focused on other risks? Do you think pandemics and other potential global disasters have not been given the attention they deserve?
Yes, I do. I think this is very clear. So, for example, in 2015, an organization put out a tweet no, it wasn't a tweet, it was an announcement that it had decided that climate change was the greatest threat to mankind in the 21st century. Now, which organization was that said that? It was the World Health Organization. Now, if that isn't evidence that the priorities were wrong within the one organization in the world whose job was to watch out for pandemics, let alone in all the other organizations that were saying the same thing, then I don't know where you will find such evidence. It is clear we are badly underprepared for pandemics. I am not claiming hindsight myself here. I did say one or two things about pandemic risk at various stages, but I also became pretty complacent about it after swine flu and Ebola and everything else. But all the other organizations in the world, all the other emphasis, all the other money, all the other philanthropists, all the other big protest organizations were starving everything else of oxygen except climate change. And I think pandemic preparedness has suffered. I mean, just simple things like getting better at making vaccines quickly is something that the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust have set up an organization called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, but they only set it up in 2017. The World Health Organization should have set that up 20 years ago.
Thank you. And one area of expertise that you have is looking at innovation and how technological progress works. Now, one thing that you often have to confront has been the precautionary principle. This idea that when we're looking at potential risks, we should take a safety first approach. And there'll be many people who have looked at the coronavirus pandemic, and they've seen, surely this is the most striking vindication when a pandemic can spiral out of control, that the precautionary principle is the right principle. What would you say about that? And what would you say are the problems of that kind of approach?
Epidemics are very different from other things because they can explode from very small beginnings to very big and uncontrollable problems with an exponential increase. And when something can do that, when something accelerates like that, then precaution is wise. yes, it would have been right to adopt the precautionary principle in pandemic preparedness up to a point. I mean, you know, if you take the precautionary principle to the absurd extent, you never get out of bed. But the precautionary principle was also used to slow down the development of all sorts of technologies that would have been useful in helping us prevent pandemics. So, for example, it takes on average 70 months to get a new medical device approved in Europe because of endless precautionary regulation. Now, what has that done? It has hugely deterred the development of diagnostic tests and other devices that would have been useful in this pandemic. So on the one hand, you must be cautious about exponential things, but climate change is not an exponential problem. It is a linear at best and possibly a diminishing problem. The effect of CO2 is a diminishing returns effect, a logarithmic effect. So it's not something where, oh my God, if we don't act now, we won't be able to catch up later. Whereas that can be true in the case of pandemics.
And finally, you've written recently about vitamin D deficiency and the role that has in people's vulnerability to this disease. Could you tell us a bit more about that and how the research has emerged on that topic?
Well, there's really interesting data sets from the Philippines and Indonesia showing that of the people in hospital with COVID, the ones who have mild cases, very few of them have vitamin D deficiency. The ones with severe cases, very few of them do not have vitamin D deficiency. We've known for over 20 years that deficiency in vitamin D makes you more vulnerable to viruses, particularly in the respiratory system, colds and flus. And we know that the people who tend to be most vitamin D deficient at the end of winter in northern climates like Britain's, and they're often very deficient in vitamin D, tend to be people who are overweight, people who are elderly, and people who have dark skin. All three of those groups have turned out to be more vulnerable to COVID-19. We need to take very seriously the possibility that telling people to take vitamin D supplements could protect them to some degree, not completely, against this virus.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next guest is Inaya Folarin Iman, and she is a freelance journalist and a campaigner on key issues like freedom of speech and democracy. Her work has taken her to the Free Speech Union, where she is now a director, and she's on the front line of defending people who may have views that other people find uncomfortable, and she's helping to defend those people. So we're very grateful for that work that she's doing, and she's going to be talking to us about the culture of catastrophism and the role of expert opinion in a democracy. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. So I guess in our culture of fear and safetyism, those that value liberty and spontaneous order have often been kind of drowned out by those that use catastrophism to, I guess, shift public opinion. And I think that that's gone hand in hand with the era. What's gone hand in hand with the era of alarmism has been this rise in a kind of technocratic, bureaucratic class, which views politics not just as a dialectic between responsible, rational agents, but as a kind of technical, data-driven science shielded from democratic oversight. And the coronavirus crisis has really compounded and accelerated a lot of these pre-existing conditions for which I write in my article in Spiked, to where we have a situation where the public have voluntarily and welcomed their indefinite relinquishing of liberty and the disillusionment of the boundaries of political power in the name of public health, with very little challenge. Now, I think that there are indeed obviously times when catastrophism is valid, but that is often if the threat is proportionate. And, you know, in my personal opinion, it's very hard to imagine a situation where indefinitely shutting down the economy, facilitating, I think, around 60% of the public being dependent on government handouts and indefinitely putting healthy people under house arrest is proportionate. So as I wrote in my essay in Spite last week, the response to the coronavirus seems to be a culmination of numerous trends. So as kind of already been mentioned, we've seen the politicization and weaponization of the precautionary principle and the infantilization of the public. As we also saw with climate change, human beings are framed as the problem, not the solution. And the worst case scenario is often framed as the likely outcome. But the problem is, spontaneous order, which accounts for kind of human innovation and creativity, as Matt Ridley was describing, is often removed from the equation. And in addition, it leads to kind of ideological diversity and dissent becoming de-incentivized. Because as we've seen again with this coronavirus crisis, who wants to be accused of essentially enabling a mass culling of humanity? So this is really also further compounded by a media establishment that seems incapable of pumping out anything other than what I would regard as paternalistic propaganda, as we also saw again with Brexit and climate change, and questions of historic and inalienable liberties often do not get asked. So I also find it curious that some of the most vociferous proponents of these fear-based narratives are often always the ones that propose greater centralization of power and top-down kind of authoritarianism as the solution to alleviate the fear that they have whipped up. But even if this time is different and the threat is so large that we must all quietly accept the imposition of this kind of rule, then we really have to ask, you know, when are these measures when are they going to end? And the question is also about precedent, because as I wrote in my article, the kind of threat of an infectious disease spontaneously arising will always be with us. And so there are some that will always argue that these measures may need to be continued in one way or another. And there is precedent for that. I mean, if we do look at 9/11, which really marked the rise of the modern surveillance state, many of the kind of surveillance capitalism that was instituted in response to 9/11 has not gone away, it's only expanded, whilst terrorism has also, and the price for being wrong has never been paid. And so this whole idea of kind of better safe than sorry, again, this whole precautionary principle, I think is often actually a shield to avoid accountability. And you know, I see it as a sign of political and moral cowardice. And I really worry about my generation. You know, I'm considered quote unquote Gen Z, and there are already so many issues in terms of like the kind of 2008 economic crash, the housing crisis that are now going to be further compounded. And I sincerely hope not, and I will be kind of doing everything I can to prevent that. But it is still deeply concerning that this notion of the kind of social contract, which doesn't just consider the present day, but also looks at the past and also making sure that generations of the future are also protected, it's just something that seems to be put out of the equation. And then the second part that I want to talk about again is the role of expert opinion in decision making, as Matt Ridley has also spoken about. And I think, you know, as already been stated, I definitely think there is a role for expertise in decision making. But the problem is the way in which this kind of expert opinion so-called becomes politicized and becomes integrated into a wider technocratic, bureaucratic infrastructure. And the expectation on top of that of deference towards these experts and the use of experts to avoid accountability. In the coronavirus situation, in my personal opinion, up until very recently, there's been hardly anything that can meaningfully be considered the science. You know, models were filled with assumptions that became remarkably similar to what I would consider an article of faith. You know, science is a method, not a fixed set of gospels that only certain people are privy to. I think there's been a really lack of honesty in this situation. You know, there's been a pressure, particularly again in response to this culture of fear and climate change, of always being seen to be doing something, even if, you know, what is being done is not effective. And we forget that experts contribute specific insight into particular phenomena, which is often divorced from the bigger picture of kind of political decision making, which is taking into account a complex array of factors. Expertise should never replace political judgment needed to make decisions, because the consequences stretch far beyond the knowledge of the expert. Politicians are not just making health judgments alone, they're making economic, social, political and moral judgments and far more. And so again, ultimately the question really has to be about proportionality. Just going off tangent, quickly. I just think it's also really interesting in terms of the parallels between climate change and coronavirus, is this notion of this kind of rise of new gods. We saw, like in climate change, we talk about the earth and nature as a god, and we've seen a very similar thing in terms of framing the NHS as, you know, something that should be worshipped. And again, these are methods that are often used to kind of shield away from genuine scrutiny. So we've already seen so many inadvertent consequences, from which potentially could also cost a lot of lasting damage, from the kind of deaths in the care homes to the rise in non-COVID deaths and the rise in domestic violence murders. You know, these are really serious things. The WHO has been wrong on several occasions. So the idea that big tech, for example, should remove anything that challenges the WHO view, and journalists like Nick Cohen, for example, or even government, who have kind of encouraged the kind of suppression of, you know, so-called disinformation, the idea that that should be encouraged is, you know, deeply disturbing. I really think that we must challenge expertise and never contract our political power in such a flippant way. And so, yeah, I guess I have painted quite a pretty bleak picture, but I also, in terms of a kind of positive note, do believe that every crisis does bring a level of opportunity. I think political resistance and how we come out of this lockdown will be key. Only if we, you know, find our voice again, as what was expected in relation to Brexit, will a positive outcome be guaranteed. I think that we can either use this as a real wake-up call, as you know, Matt Ridley talks about, in terms of realizing that experts are not infallible, or we can, you know, continue to slip into this abyss of fear and the kind of greater hyper-regulation and securitization of everyday life. And there are short-term things that are being done and can be done. I think I saw on Twitter the other day that there was a crowdfunding exercise that was launched in terms of doing a judicial review. And that's really important in terms of finding out whether or not this was proportionate and even lawful in order to kind of set the boundaries for the future. But I think we also need to continue to speak out and not kowtow to those that are seeking to kind of define the framework to which we can understand the world around us, because ultimately we are all going to be paying the price for this, and therefore, you know, no one wants to know that they didn't speak out when they could have. And also a really important thing in the short term, I'm not sure that this is going to be done, but I think that we really need to push for a frank and open acceptance that perhaps potentially we took the wrong course. You know, we were told consistently that this was the only course. There was, you know, eerily unified choir of voices telling us that this was the only action in the beginning. All of the journalists are saying, why aren't you locking down? I think we need to push for an admittance of this was the wrong course. It was never the only mechanism of responding to this virus. We've seen various different mechanisms in terms of response, even Sweden, as many people have pointed to. But broadly and societally, I think we need a real deeper and widespread campaign in terms of understanding liberty, freedom, you know, courage and adventure, and a fundamental rejection of this culture of fear and the sanctification of safety. I mean, I've been posting on Twitter critical of even, for example, some of the people that have been censored. And I've never seen so many people tell me that, you know, certain views are dangerous and this is going to, and they should be censored. I think the arguments in terms of freedom and liberty are just, I think, are at a low level of understanding. You know, freedom is being reconceptualized as what the government allows us to do, as opposed to the very nature of being itself. And on top of that, I think we really need to look into our kind of civil liberties, civil society infrastructure. There's been some organizations that have been pushing back against this, like Big Brother Watch, but a lot of organizations in the UK, unfortunately, have been, you know, incredibly silent, and this is really the area that they should be looking into. But perhaps I will just end on like something I think is probably the most important. I think that we really need to reclaim the notion that we are autonomous, right-thinking decision makers, because we need to take responsibility for our actions, because unless we are willing to do that, take responsibility for our future, we will succumb to the reality of others and continue to be infantilized. And I just think, you know, that needs to end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inaya. That was a really inspiring message to end on there about how we can look forward to the future and reclaim political agency, personal freedom. So my first question to you would be, are we actually losing the battle at the moment? And with your experiences standing as a political campaigner to run for Parliament for the Brexit Party at the general election last year, what did you learn about campaigning about these values? And how do you sell a message of autonomy and agency and personal freedom to a public that's actually being more and more tempted by this safety first, risk averse approach that's maybe you described it as infantilizing?
You know, I think currently, unfortunately, I don't think we're winning the battle. And this is what I kind of wrote in my article, and what I said in this introduction is that I think it is a kind of growing trend, and we've seen a kind of hollowing out, not just, you know, from a kind of political standpoint, but we've also seen it as I've kind of written about and spoken about in terms of the universities, you know, the kind of intellectual diversity and kind of intellectual infrastructure, which kind of becomes the brain of society and champions a lot of these fundamental values of liberty and democracy, just aren't there. And so I think we unfortunately currently are losing the battle. But I think, for example, you know, in terms of Toby founding the Free Speech Union, on top of that, even just small and consistent pushback is actually really, really fundamentally effective. I've already seen, for example, the Oxford University have now pushed back against some of the students that are trying to suppress ideological diversity on campus. So it really takes us as individuals to be kind of proactive in championing it. And I think, you know, taking away, to answer your second question in terms of, you know, how do we sell this message as something that's everybody can accept, I think that we have to move this concept of liberty away from being this kind of abstract concept of like these amazing Enlightenment philosophers, and also think about it as in terms of genuinely a way of being. I think liberty is kind of a way in which you live, you know, reconnecting with these kind of cultural heroes that see adventure and like the hero's journey and championing freedom as part of our lives. And so I think that it takes for us as individuals to really become active participants in doing that and taking risks going forward.
Thank you. And finally, we've seen some polling in the United Kingdom that's been suggesting that Britain, of all countries, is maybe the most favourable towards keeping the lockdown and the most favourable towards having the lockdown in the first place. Why do you think Britain in particular has been in the grip of this culture of fear?
Yeah, I think, you know, that's a really important question. And this is something that I have been thinking about recently. You know, someone suggested to me, I'm not sure that this is true, but someone suggested that in all of that kind of democratic and passion that arose with Brexit, there was almost a kind of a sense of dejection after that. I'm not sure that is necessarily the reason. You know, I think the Conservatives, for example, have a huge majority and also can ride off of the spirit of like listening to the kind of electorate, and therefore people have a lot of trust in, you know, the Tories and Boris and all of these types of things. And so there isn't a sentiment of a kind of adversarial relationship between the kind of political establishment currently and the electorate in ways that there might be in, for example, America. So I think it's still something ongoing that I think, you know, is a really important question. But I think in terms of what I was saying, in terms of the universities and the kind of media establishment having only one voice, I think that's also a really important point. You know, when the run-up came, there was only one view that we were being told, and therefore that fear and panic was being ramped up, and we didn't have that challenge in terms of actually hearing the potential that there could be something else, a different course to go down.
Okay, thank you very much, Inaya, and we look forward to hearing from you again in a short moment's time. Our next speaker has had an extraordinary career. He began off founding the Modern Review with his friend of the time, Julie Burchill, and this was extraordinarily pioneering new magazine that was bringing highbrow critique of music to a mass audience. And in what would be a sort of, you might say, familiar pattern, it was tumultuous, and soon he was in America. And he has charted his failure, as he describes it, to take Manhattan in a best-selling book, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which was made into a film with Simon Pegg. But I think in terms of what I think is perhaps his greatest achievements was two things, and that was founding and being a pioneer for the free schools movement, because I think that was the very most important achievement of the coalition government, which was bringing parents, teachers together and society together to allow more freedom in education. And the legacy of that has been incredibly important. And now, of course, you have set up the Free Speech Union, which is providing a vital avenue for people to be allowed to express their beliefs. And that's so fundamental to a free society. So we're very, very grateful to have you with us. And please take it away.
Thank you, Harry. This is almost like a meeting of the Free Speech Union, because Matt is a member of the Advisory Council, Inaya is a director. So can I just take this opportunity to give the FSU a little plug? You'll see the poster behind me, but if anyone is interested in joining, it's freespeechunion.org, and you can become a member if you're a student or a pensioner or you live overseas for as little as £3 a month. And as Inaya says, we've already chalked up several victories. So I think it's proving to be a very effective organization, but the more people join, the better. Like Inaya, and I suspect Matt, I believe that the lockdown isn't an effective way of managing this particular pandemic. I'm a lockdown skeptic, and another recent venture I've started, Harry, is a website called lockdownskeptics.org, which is a sort of hub for people who are skeptical about the effectiveness of lockdowns to gather and share data and generally whinge. So I thought I'm very interested in why governments across the world rushed into this particular policy, even though the evidence that it would be an effective way to manage the pandemic is pretty thin, pretty speculative. And I do think it has a lot to do with the veneration of experts, particularly experts who have institutional authority, and particularly those experts who have both institutional authority and some sort of official status, advisory status, vis-a-vis governments, whether nationally or internationally, like the WHO, for instance. The reluctance to challenge the scientific experts who've largely driven, I think, this policy response around the world, I think in part has to do with some of the things that Inaya and Matt have talked about, which is a sort of culture of fear around challenging people, particularly people in possession of a good deal of authority of various kinds, experts, challenging them, fearing that you will be denigrated, ridiculed, publicly shamed, cancelled, cast out, and so forth. And I think if we do conclude in a few years' time that the lockdowns were a colossal error, the largest policy error of perhaps, well, certainly of our lifetimes, but perhaps dating back much longer than that. If we do conclude that, then I think we need to try and understand why it is we've made this terrible, catastrophic error. And I think it has a lot to do with the decline in the culture of dissent and free speech. But I thought before going into more detail about why it is we've made this mistake, I thought it might be useful just to do a quick canter through the case against lockdowns, because I'm sure there'll be some people listening to this that actually think lockdowns were a pretty good idea. Certainly we know, as Inaya said, that the majority of the British public are very supportive of our lockdown. And I think even today, a majority don't want the lockdown to be lifted. So what is the case against? Well, I think the first point to make is that it is a completely new way of managing a pandemic. It had whole population lockdowns, whether in regions or in countries, has almost never been tried before this year. The earliest example I could find was in 17th century Florence during an outbreak of plague. And that doesn't seem to have been particularly effective because 12% of the population died. People often cite the response of different US cities to the Spanish flu pandemic as evidence that lockdowns work. And St. Louis is often held up as a model of how to respond to a pandemic. But actually, if you look at the measures taken by the city of St. Louis in 1918, it doesn't even come close to resembling what we think of as lockdowns. So modest social distancing measures were recommended. People were encouraged to wear masks when in public, but businesses weren't shut down. They were only shut down, I think, for 48 hours. So the only time St. Louis had anything like a lockdown was for 2 days and no more. In the flu pandemics of 1956 to 7 and 1968 to 69, nowhere was a lockdown attempted as a way of trying to manage, to mitigate the impact of those pandemics. Indeed, we all know from our pop culture history that the Woodstock Music Festival was held in America in 1968 in the midst of a pandemic which killed more people. There were more excess deaths as a result of seasonal flu in the US between 68 and 69 than there have been in the US to date from COVID-19. In 2009, I think Mexico attempted to lock down its population in response to swine flu, but it abandoned that policy after 18 days because of the alarming and mounting social and economic costs. Interestingly, the WHO looked at how best to manage another influenza pandemic and published a paper on this in 2019 and did not recommend population-wide lockdowns. It didn't recommend the quarantining of the healthy. People will say, well, this isn't an influenza epidemic, but actually in this paper that the WHO published in 2019, it looked at whether lockdowns would have been an effective way of reducing the fatalities during the Spanish flu pandemic and concluded that they wouldn't have. So even the WHO, until very recently, thought that lockdowns weren't an effective way of managing pandemics. And curiously, I don't know if you noticed this, Harry, but one of the senior panjandrums in the WHO gave a press conference last week in which he actually held up Sweden as a model of how to respond to a pandemic. So it seems even the WHO is now hedging, having changed its mind. It's now seemingly changing its mind back again. Well, why did the WHO change its mind? It seemed to have something to do with China's response to the pandemic. So China locked down large sections of its population. It locked down the province of Hubei after the outbreak in Wuhan at the very beginning of the year. The WHO in February praised China's response to the pandemic as a model response, even though China's authorities actually locked up everyone they tested who tested positive for COVID-19 in these purpose-built hospitals, whether they needed hospital care or not, and actually boarded up people who tested negatives. They literally boarded them into their homes. The WHO thought this was a model way to respond to the pandemic, but the fact that an organization with the authority of the WHO praised China for responding in this way, I think in part was one of the reasons that governments around the world concluded that this was the correct way to try and mitigate the impact, to try and reduce the number of fatalities caused by the coronavirus outbreak. Why do I think this was a mistake? Apart from the fact that it's never been tried before. Well, in order to say that with any confidence, we need to do a sort of cost-benefit analysis. We need to assess, well, first of all, what's been the benefit of lockdowns, and then we need to assess what their cost is. And those are fiendishly difficult things to do. In terms of assessing the benefit, that requires us to examine, in this country, for instance, we need to look at the modelling of Professor Neil Ferguson and his team at Imperial College and see how reliable its estimates of how many people would have died here and in America and elsewhere had we stuck with more modest social distancing measures, had we stuck with our mitigation strategy and not moved to a suppression strategy. Well, there are plenty of reasons for being skeptical about Professor Ferguson's modelling, and I'll just rattle through three of them here. In 2002, he predicted that mad cow disease would kill up to 50,000 people. It ended up killing less than 200. In 2005, he told The Guardian that up to 200 million people would probably die from bird flu. The final death toll from avian flu was, in fact, 440. And in 2009, a government estimate based on one of Professor Ferguson's models estimated the likely death toll from swine flu at 65,000, and that was in the UK. In fact, it was 457. Well, defenders of Professor Ferguson, defenders of the Imperial College modelling, can say, well, the reason the death tolls weren't higher is because the government followed Professor Ferguson's advice. How do you know that those death tolls, those predictions were wild exaggerations? What's the control group? Well, in this case, happily, we do have a control in the form of Sweden. Sweden, as I'm sure everyone watching this knows, did not impose a lockdown on its population. Instead, it stuck with a mitigation strategy. And a group of scientists in Uppsala, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Uppsala University in Sweden, at the beginning of April, in an attempt to persuade the Swedish authorities to impose a lockdown and abandon what they thought of as its reckless strategy, they plugged Sweden's numbers, as they then were, into the Imperial College model, and it spat out various predictions. It said that the total death toll, this was using Professor Ferguson's model, the total death toll in Sweden would be close to 100,000 if it stuck with mitigation. And by the 1st of May, it would be at least 40,000. Well, we know that that was wrong because Sweden stuck with mitigation, and the death toll on the 1st of May in Sweden was somewhere in the region of 2,750. Now, I'm sure we'll be arguing for a long time about how reliable the estimates of the Imperial College and other models were, but it's beginning to look that they wildly exaggerated just how many people would succumb to COVID-19 if government stuck with more modest social distancing policies rather than went for full lockdowns. And there's plenty of other evidence about the ineffectiveness of lockdowns. The other side of the ledger is, well, how do we calculate what the cost of lockdowns is? And that's quite difficult too, not least because it's hard to disentangle the effect of the lockdown and the effect of the virus absent a lockdown. So we can talk, for instance, about the public health costs of lockdowns. We can talk about the number of patients requiring critical hospital care who haven't been hospitalized. It could be that some of them stayed away from hospitals just out of fear of catching coronavirus, not just because we locked down. But it looks as though, I think the government a couple of weeks ago were looking at estimates of an excess number of deaths around about 150,000, not people who died of COVID-19, but people who succumbed to other diseases as a result of the lockdown. We learnt from Bob Diamond, the head of the ONS, who appeared on Sunday, that the ONS is actually trying to calculate the number of indirect deaths, people who've died not from COVID-19, but from other causes during this period. And they're working with, amongst others, the government actuaries department. But various economists have tried to calculate the likely loss of life resulting from lockdowns and compared that to the number of lives we think we may have saved as a result of imposing lockdowns, and come to the conclusion that the loss of life as a result of lockdowns will be far greater than it would have been had we stuck with mitigation. So, for instance, a couple of fellows of the Actuarial Society of South Africa recently did this calculation, and they concluded that the loss of life as a result of the lockdown that's been imposed in South Africa would be 29 times greater than the number of lives saved as a result of the lockdown. But that may in part be because in South Africa, as I understand it, more people have actually been shot by the police trying to enforce South Africa's lockdown than have actually died of COVID-19. Anyway, I think that there is a pretty persuasive case that lockdowns have been a catastrophic mistake, an infliction of self-harm on an unparalleled scale in response to a kind of herd-like stampede to follow the advice of various experts, but in particular the WHO. And I think we need to try and understand why we made this mistake. And as I said at the beginning, I think it is all tied up with the decline in the culture of dissent, the culture of free speech, particularly in this country, but also around the world. People are extremely reluctant, extremely fearful about challenging these sorts of prognoses made by people like Professor Neil Ferguson, particularly when they have the authority of Imperial College and sitting on committees like SAGE. People are very, very nervous that their own reputations will suffer if they have the temerity to challenge these analyses, however feeble they think they are. And we need to do more, I think, to protect dissenters, to protect mavericks, to protect people who feel inclined to speak up but are too frightened to do so, if we're going to avoid a catastrophe on this scale happening again.
Thank you very much, Toby. So my first question would be, as a veteran of Twitter storms, how do you see this most recent episode, and what do you think is driving the people who are perhaps choosing not to accept that you might have thought about this, that your motivations might be the same as theirs in terms of wanting to protect lives, wanting to protect people's well-being, and sort of portray you as this sort of heartless person who doesn't, in their eyes, care about saving lives and things like, and protecting the NHS as much as they do. Perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I think one leg of the case against lockdowns is that if you try and put a monetary cost on the lives we have supposedly saved by placing our citizens under virtual house arrest, and then you look at the likely economic cost resulting from the impact of these lockdowns, that the latter is far, far higher than the former. That is one argument. I don't think it's the most persuasive argument. It is certainly one. And if you make that argument, you're at risk of being accused of being heartless. People think that it's somehow neoliberal or a uniquely Tory thing for people to try and put a monetary value on a person's life. But actually, it's something that public health economists in all governments do, whether Labour or Conservative. It's not a demonic, diabolical innovation that critics of the lockdown have come up with. But I do think that's only one argument. But I think more broadly, I certainly think that the US tech giants and their various subsidiaries have contributed to a culture of conformity, to this culture of herd opinion becoming so dominant, particularly in contemporary politics. And YouTube have done that explicitly during this particular crisis by kicking people off if they challenge the prevailing orthodoxy about the causes of the pandemic and the best way to manage the pandemic. Several people have been kicked off YouTube. The CEO of YouTube, who incidentally was one of the people who made sure that James Damore was sacked when he challenged the prevailing office culture at Google. The CEO of YouTube has actually said on TV that if anyone challenges the WHO's recommendations about how best to deal with this crisis, they'll be kicked off YouTube. And it must be quite a job for whoever the kind of chief moderator is at YouTube to try and keep up with what the WHO's recommendations are, because they seem to change on a sixpence on a virtually daily basis. But nonetheless, we're expected to not only monitor what they are, but not in any way dissent from them if we want to remain on YouTube. Facebook has done the same. In this country, one of the things the Free Speech Union objected to recently was Ofcom's reprimand of both ITV and London Live for dissenting from official orthodoxy about the causes of the coronavirus pandemic. This was in connection with David Icke. David Icke gave an interview on London Live in which he made a link between 5G radio masts and coronavirus, and Eamon Holmes, a presenter on one of the ITV breakfast programs, he didn't say that he thought that David Icke had a point. He described David Icke's hypothesis as stupid and silly, but at the same time he said that nonetheless it deserved a hearing in the public square, if only so it could be comprehensively rebutted. And it wasn't right that we should just ban him from talking about it, as Facebook has done. And just for saying that, just for suggesting that we should discuss the possibility of a link between 5G masts and coronavirus, Eamon Holmes and ITV have been reprimanded by Ofcom. So that I think that's a really sinister and dangerous development. And it's particularly alarming because Ofcom has been tasked under the British government's online harms policy. It will shortly be responsible for policing what we say on social media platforms and removing content that it regards as inappropriate or offensive. So it's shown itself, I think, to be particularly unfit to play that role. The government has in mind for it by reprimanding ITV and London Live merely for dissenting from COVID orthodoxy. But I think in a number of ways, the US tech giants, various government agencies have contributed to the suppression of dissent during this particular moment, which I think is ultimately what's responsible for what has been a colossal error of judgment as far as policy is concerned.
Well, we at the GWPF are certainly very familiar with that kind of approach, and we've seen YouTube put banners underneath our videos, which takes you to a link which goes to the Wikipedia page on about climate change. What we're supposed to be denying, what factual inaccuracies we're supposed to have committed is never said, but it's nonetheless felt necessary by the authorities at YouTube to put this disclaimer on our videos. And indeed that we hope that this webinar, which is being streamed live on YouTube, is not going to be taken down. Hopefully it's still up and running. But just finally then, I would like to look at the global geopolitical consequences of this. We've seen global institutions under increasing pressure in recent years. We've seen some people try and defend them and other people try to criticize them. Will the China's role in initially covering up information about the virus and Trump's response to that and his decision to revoke funding for the WHO have a significant role in what will be a very important political year?
Is that one for me, Harry, or for
yes, and then we'll move on to group questions.
Yes, well, the WHO certainly hasn't covered itself in glory during this particular crisis. I think if the various inquiries, and I'm sure there'll be dozens, probably every major Western democracy will launch a public inquiry into how governments managed this particular pandemic. And if the conclusions of those inquiries are broadly that governments made a mistake in locking their countries down, then I think they'll look for a scapegoat. And it seems to me that the WHO is in the frame at the moment. I don't know whether by cozying up to the Chinese authorities and perhaps other authoritarian regimes, whether it may in fact kind of survive this particular storm. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if in 5 years' time, the WHO no longer exists, at least not in its present form. That may be wildly optimistic. What do you think, Matt?
Me, Harry.
There we go.
I'm not as optimistic about the WHO being in the frame as you are, Toby. And the climate change example has shown a real problem here, which is that as soon as Donald Trump is on your side, the rest of the world is against you. In other words, the fact that he has attacked the WHO has brought all sorts of people out to defend it, who might otherwise have been natural allies in this battle. And I'm not saying he's wrong or right. I'm just saying that that's a phenomenon of the polarization of the world. And these international bodies have a horrible habit of being completely unaccountable. I mean, I've been bashing the WHO for, I think, 4 years now on completely different issues. They've been extraordinarily dishonest, actually, on the issue of tobacco control and vaping. They actually put out a tweet or an announcement, I should say, I think it was in January, when they should have been concentrating on COVID-19, which said that there was antifreeze in vaping products. Well, this was confusing two different chemicals, both of which happen to have the word glycol in them, but they're completely different chemicals. You know, that sort of level of inaccuracy. Margaret Chan, the predecessor of Tedros as head of the WHO, actually said that vaping is the one of the 4 top priorities for the world for world health. Another example of the WHO being asleep at the switch when it comes to the real threats and concentrating on the wrong ones. But I don't myself see a mechanism by which the WHO is brought to account for this. Unless more countries follow Donald Trump in cutting off funding, the UK is now, I think, the largest sovereign funder of the WHO. I think it's larger than China. The UN itself may be a larger funder. You know, that might be why the word sovereign is in there. But we've just increased our funding to it.
Thank you, Matt. Well, we've had many questions come in from our viewers, and so I'm going to kick things off with one that came in actually in an email beforehand, which was, has this pandemic killed off Extinction Rebellion? Inaya, would you like to start off with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has. I think as we've already been describing, there's actually quite a lot of remarkable parallels in terms of what Extinction Rebellion has been calling for, in terms of, you know, reducing international travel, people, you know, leaving their home less and like going in cars and all of those things less. Now they can almost argue that, you know, we can do those things without it, you know, drastically destroying our lives. So I think that obviously we're going to have to wait and see in terms of how this is going to pan out when the lockdown opens. But I don't think that we can be complacent in thinking that Extinction Rebellion or any of those kind of more radical environmentalist groups will not utilize this in order to continue to capitalize on their political goals. There was something specifically that I just wanted to quickly say in regards to the China comment that was made. Also, I think that, you know, as what Matt Ridley said, in terms of many people think that if Trump thinks something, that must obviously mean that it's wrong. But I think this situation has unbelievably vindicated a lot of what Trump said in terms of, for example, the way in which China, even before the situation, was utilizing, for example, even their international students to suppress dissent at universities. That's something that hasn't really been talked about. there's this whole question of Huawei and things like that. And, you know, there was an article in the Atlantic a couple of weeks ago, which said that when it comes to the kind of surveilling and censoring of speech in the online world, China was right and kind of America was wrong. And it was really astonishing to see many people on the political left actually, you know, arguing that the kind of deeply authoritarian measures of China was actually the right way. So I think that that has been exposed. And I hope from this, many of the geopolitical relationships and even kind of bringing jobs back to countries will actually be continued to do and vindicated. So yeah, just responding to that on China as well.
Can I come in quickly on both of those points? Inaya makes some excellent points there, but I think and we have seen we've exposed the extraordinary dependence of British higher education on China and the degree to which it has kowtowed in a most craven manner on the subject, Cambridge University in particular. And I think there will be pushback. I think she's absolutely right there. I'm more optimistic than she is about whether this is hold Extinction Rebellion below the waterline. Because although in the short run, yes, there are going to be people going around saying, see, we can live without cars and visits to our grandchildren and things like that. It's all fine. I don't think anyone wants this state of affairs to continue in perpetuity. And I think the vast majority of people are looking forward very much to going on holiday again, seeing their family again, going to a party again, going to a football match again, and they will have had a taste. And we must rub this message in of what life would be like if Extinction Rebellion got their way. This is exactly what they've been calling for. No travel, much less energy use, and everybody trying to grow their own vegetables at home.
The funny thing about that, Matt, is that you'll recall that at the very beginning of this crisis, Jeremy Corbyn hailed what was happening in the country as the economy gradually ground to a halt as a great illustration of what he'd been fighting for years. So as you say, it has been a sort of worst case scenario of exactly what would happen.
With several million unemployed, I think extreme environmentalism will look sillier and sillier in the next couple of years. That tends to happen. It happened in the wake of the financial crisis 10 years ago, but it will be back at some point until we sort out the indoctrination of young people in universities on the topic.
Thank you, everyone. Our next question is about scientific forecasting and scientific models. Is faith in scientific models and scientific forecasting going to increase or decrease after this pandemic? And what are both the benefits of more skepticism, but also perhaps there are some threats around a lack of faith in science? And if that turns people away from a more empiricist tradition, then that would be something to be concerned about as well. Matt, would you like to start off on that?
Well, I think the degree to which we have now introduced the point that there is scientific uncertainty, that decisions are taken under uncertainty, that we're in a fog, we can't wait for the fog to lift before we take decisions. I think that is helpful. But you know, we always overestimate the degree to which a crisis like this changes the world. An awful lot of people go back to doing what they were before. Scientists will come out of this, some of them with their reputations tarnished, but I don't think there will be any great diminution. I would like to see a huge distinction made between the importance of data in helping us through this crisis, and it is going to be vital. I mean, we are about to get decent data at last on where the transmission is happening, how many people are being made immune, et cetera, and that will surely enable us to do a much more intelligent approach. So, you know, we mustn't throw the baby of good data use, good empirical science out with the bathwater of modeling predictions being discredited. But I am, you know, I'm genuinely embarrassed that this country's one main contribution to the world seems to have, in this crisis, seems to have been the Imperial College model. And we even boasted about it. I mean, we heard the chief medical officer saying, well, yeah, okay, other countries have done better at testing, but we've done better at modeling. Well, I'm afraid that's bad news all round.
Inaya, would you like to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of echo the same sentiments. I think that in terms of just public awareness, in terms of how scientists aren't infallible, I think is a positive thing. And I think that that will kind of improve for in terms of future pandemics and situations, to know that, you know, we do need skepticism and intellectual diversity. But on top of that, you know, I don't think we're going to see a situation in which it's going to go too far and people, you know, chuck out the baby with the bathwater, because at the end of the day, we are still going to be relying on scientists when it comes to treatments and, you know, a potential vaccine. And I don't think that, so I think that there's still obviously a really important role to play in regards to the way in which science contributes to these kind of complex situations that arise.
Yeah, I think, Harry, what I hope will be one of the outcomes is a general decline in scientism, but not science. So I think of scientism as a kind of veneration of scientists who happen to share your liberal politics. So you can then dress up your own policy preferences as having the authority of science, and I hope that phenomenon gradually fades after this. One interesting point I thought that Michael Levitt made. He's the professor of structural biology at Stanford and the winner of the 2013 Nobel Prize for Chemistry. When he was interviewed last week on Unheard, he's very skeptical about the Imperial College model. And he says that one of the difficulties that Professor Ferguson's run into is that if you are an epidemiologist tasked with advising the government on how to respond to a dangerous new bug like this, you're incentivized to overestimate the likely death toll rather than underestimate it. And that's because if you underestimate it and the government does nothing and many more people than you predicted die, that really does harm your reputation. But if you overestimate it and you get it slightly wrong, or even very wrong, your reputation remains intact. You're not punished in the same way for committing an error, not like a normal scientist would be. You can commit errors in one direction and be forgiven. You commit errors in the other and you're not. And the other incentive Professor Ferguson and his team had to exaggerate the likely death toll is that the higher they predict the death toll will be absent a lockdown, the more likely a government is to lock down, and their hypothesis will therefore not be tested, because they can say, ah, yes, that was the scenario we painted absent a lockdown, but because you've locked down, nothing like that number of people have died. And they can sort of almost cite that as proof that their modeling is sound. But luckily, I think in this case, we do have the control group in the form of Sweden to demonstrate just how wildly exaggerated their apocalyptic estimates were.
Toby, there are very close parallels there with the climate change situation, where for the last 20 years, wildly exaggerated claims about what was going to happen by now, you know, how we were going to be under 6 feet of water by now, or everything had turned into a desert, etc. All the Arctic ice would be gone. Al Gore and everyone else, they've made these predictions year in, year out, and they've been wrong. And there seems to be absolutely no pushback. No journalist ever says, but hang on, Mr. Gore, didn't you say this 10 years ago and weren't you wrong then? So you're absolutely right that it's completely asymmetric. You're wildly alarmist and you don't get beaten up for it. And indeed you get more publicity for it. If you say no, I think it's not a problem, they say we'll call you back. We don't need you on the show.
So the next question I'd like to ask is, what is the advantage of economists in all of this? We have seen, both in climate change and with this pandemic, a conflict emerging between what economists are saying and what maybe climate scientists or epidemiologists are saying. And I think of the recent revelation that the SAGE Government Committee, that's the panel that's looking at managing pandemics in the UK, they had no economists on that panel. And I think that's clearly driving some of the decision making. So I'd like to ask people, do they think the government was actually on a better course, a more Sweden-like course, until it buckled under public pressure? How can governments resist that kind of pressure and stick with their instincts, perhaps economically? Toby?
Well, I do think that there seems to be more diversity of opinion amongst economists than certainly amongst other branches of the social sciences. I actually looked at the list of who's on the behavioral science subgroup of SAGE today, and was disappointed to see that there were very few economists, but there were plenty of social psychologists, anthropologists, historians, and so forth. And if you look at the data around political bias within different academic fields, in history, left of center academics outnumber right of center academics by a ratio of something approaching 50 to 1. Amongst economists, they fare generally much better. It's only about 2 or 3 to 1 amongst economists. So I do think that at least if the government is relying on the advice of economists, it's likely to have a broader range of views to choose from, and probably a more intelligent discussion than if it relies on a group of academics, 99% of whom are left of center. I think it's not clear exactly why the government did a U-turn and decided to abandon its mitigation strategy and embrace a suppression strategy. It was clearly partly that they were spooked by the Imperial College modelling and the predictions of how many would die and how quickly the NHS would be overwhelmed absent a lockdown. Partly, as you say, public opinion seemed to be in favour of more extreme restrictions being put in place than had been put in place on March 16th. But you can see it was also just kind of natural political caution. I mean, if you from a politician's point of view, it may be, they may have even understood, let's suppose Boris understood that locking down the economy would, in the long term, cause a far greater loss of life than sticking with mitigation. Nonetheless, politically, that's not a reason to stick with mitigation, because you're going to be punished much more severely if the NHS is overwhelmed and if there is a large number of fatalities in a 2 or 3 week time horizon than you are by the mounting invisible deaths over the much longer term time horizon. So you can see why politicians, just the nature of liberal democracy, would be inclined to take extreme measures to prevent something bad happening in the immediate future, regardless of the long-term catastrophic consequences.
Inaya?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with what Toby said, but in terms of it not being clear that why the government changed tack, I do think obviously there does seem to be an element in terms of they were spooked, but I do think that at the time there was also complete conformity in terms of a lot of the lobby journalists and the journalists that had direct interaction with the government were often kind of pushing for these extreme measures. And so a lot of the time that is some of the main narratives that were heard by the public. I mean, there was very few mainstream media journalists, Peter Hitchens, yourself, Toby, Brendan O'Neill, which were actually challenging the kind of catastrophizing that was being put forward. So in terms of kind of economists having more intellectual diversity, I think, you know, that is probably true. But as we also saw with Brexit, you know, with any kind of sense of expertise, they can also be instrumentalized to push forward a political agenda. And so that's why we need to have a really strong kind of political and media establishment that are also willing to ask the right questions. We had the kind of suspension of an opposition during this situation, and even before the coronavirus situation, we've already had a very problematic situation with kind of the Labour Party and the opposition in this country. So many of the fail-safes democratically that are meant to respond when these questions emerge, the media, the opposition, you know, public scrutiny, just have not been able to function in the same way during this crisis.
Can I come in on that 2 points quickly? One is that economists had their Waterloo in the great financial crisis of 10 years ago, and they were pretty comprehensively discredited as a profession. And there were, you know, every conceivable kind of joke about economists was doing the rounds after that. And they were discredited because of their failure to forecast. And actually, in that respect, they're no worse than any other scientist or expert. We can't forecast the future in these complex, chaotic systems, as I've pointed out. So this might be the moment when the rest of science, as it were, gets the same treatment. That this might be the moment when the failure to forecast in other areas is also damaged. And for a lot of us, economists, as Inaya has just pointed out, got a bloody nose from Brexit too, by making Project Fear forecasts that turned out wrong. Just on lockdown skepticism, I wasn't a lockdown skeptic originally. I was worried that we were too slow in some respects, letting football matches and race meetings go ahead and things like that, but too draconian in other respects. What has changed my mind is the epidemiology, the understanding that the clear evidence now that children are not spreading this virus hardly at all, and therefore shutting schools is crazy. That open air small meetings, I mean, there's a very good analysis on Twitter today by somebody from St Andrews University of all the studies that have been done on how this virus is transmitted. And it turns out it's basically a nosocomial infection. That is to say, it's spread in the healthcare system and in care homes. All we needed was to stop washing our hands, start washing our hands, stop shaking hands, you know, all those sort of things, the voluntary stuff that we were doing, and we'd have been all right. But I didn't know that, and I didn't understand that in mid-March, and so I withheld my skepticism about the draconian lockdown, and I was also hugely taken aback by the degree to which the public and the police enthusiastically joined in, locking everybody down and shaming people if they didn't do the right things, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. One thing that's come up a number of times in the Q&A is people are bringing up this film by Michael Moore, The Planet of the Humans, in which he explores some of the environmental consequences of renewables. And this has been met with an enormous backlash from the Green Movement, who have demanded that it's banned, that its distributors no longer carry this film. I wonder if any of you have seen it. And I wonder if you could also comment on a certain movement that's emerging for people to say, this lockdown shows that we can live more simple, basic lives, that capitalism has led us to a precipice, and we need to embrace a sort of simplified, less consuming alternative. And that's certainly one of the themes of Michael Moore's film as well. So I wonder if we've probably just got time for that one more question.
Okay, very quickly, just to say I'm absolutely loving Michael Moore's film because of the way it's got the Greens tearing lumps out of each other, and finally confronting some of the questions over the absurdities of renewable energy. But behind it lies a very neo-Malthusian, dystopian view of the world that we should all be going back and living in caves, which is not going to be very helpful, and which, you know, the one thing this episode has taught us is that we need innovation, we need technology, we need better vaccines, we need better diagnostic tests, we need all these kind of things. And you can't have those without energy, and the best way to get energy is to get it from dense sources where you don't have to chop down forests to produce it. You know, last time I checked, nothing eats coal, whereas everything eats wood. So, you know, if you're trying to fuel the human economy off wood, you're going to steal woodpeckers' lunch. Well, we're not stealing anybody's lunch when we're burning coal. That's a particular point that I'm keen about.
Harry, yeah, I haven't seen Michael Moore's film, so I won't comment on that. But one of the things which strikes me about the various anti-capitalists somehow hailing lockdowns as evidence that we could all live much simpler, happier existences is that almost without exception, they themselves aren't suffering in any way. They've either been furloughed, or they're public service employees, so they're on effectively full wages, or they're living with their parents in nice manor houses in the home counties with large gardens, paddocks full of livestock and so forth. If you're you know, living at the top of a tower block, and you've got 3 kids that aren't at school, and you're a taxi driver, and you're currently kind of embroiled in an endless negotiation with HMRC about how much money you earned as a sole trader in the last year because you want to be compensated in some way for your lack of income, then I don't think this is a great advertisement for the kind of society that Extinction Rebellion want us all to live in. It reminds me a bit of the various celebrities who've been bellyaching about lockdown, like Sam Smith, for instance, who was photographed crying on the steps of his £12 million North London mansion because he's finding social isolation so difficult. I think Ellen DeGeneres stuck a little video of herself from her 2,000-acre ranch in Montana, talking about how difficult she was finding it to be locked down. But we were all in this together, so we better stick with it. It's ludicrous. I think it shows you just how out of touch these green activists are with ordinary people's lives.
Thank you. Over to you, Inaya, for the final word.
Yeah, so I haven't seen Michael Moore's film either, but I have seen some of the response to it, and there was an article in The Guardian, you know, calling for it, or kind of platforming people that were calling for it to be taken down. And there was a tweet that went viral with that also showed that even in that article there was not a single example of why that particular documentary should be taken down. There is no evidence or example to demonstrate that. And so I think it just, you know, highlights again what we've been saying in terms of this kind of cancel culture that appeals to emotion, appeals to kind of people's, you know, sensibilities and vulnerabilities, and doesn't treat people as rational individuals that are not passive recipients of information, that can make judgments for themselves and come to their own conclusions. And so,
well, thank you very much. That's a brilliant point to end on.
Can I just add one thing, Harry, just to say that my beard got the thumbs up in the comments, but more importantly, everybody thinks Inaya should be Prime Minister, and they're absolutely right.
Well, I'd certainly concur with that. So finally, just a very big thank you from me and from the GWPF. We're absolutely delighted to have you 3 on to talk to us in what's been a very fascinating, wide-ranging, engaging conversation. So thank you very much. Please, if you're not already following us on Twitter, we're at the GWPF.com and we're at the GWPF on Facebook. And we do hope to be continuing these discussions on social media and hopefully to do another webinar very soon. Thank you all for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, Harry. See you later, guys.
Bye.